So many of you that have been around for a while know that my background is Swedish. My parents live over in Sweden, and my last name is Bidell. Now, Bidell is actually not a Swedish last name, believe it or not. Even though my family has been in Sweden for as long as we know of, the family farm back in Sweden has been in our family for 16 generations. And I've traced our family tree back to 1651. And the reason I couldn't go any further than that is because in Sweden, back up until the year 2000, the church, the state church, which is Lutheran, kept all of the records of births and deaths and marriages and so on and so forth. And the church where our family records were kept was burned down in 1651. So all the records from earlier than that are destroyed. But we don't have a Swedish name. So how did this happen? So I just wanted to tell a little story about extended family conflict. So the farm the family farm was split between the sons for many, many times over those generations. And my grandfather, whose name was August, he split the farm again with his brother, and his name was Åke. And their last name at that time was Eriksson. Now, Eriksson is a very common Swedish last name. But the problem was that both of them married Annas. So my grandmother, her name was Anna Eriksson, and my uncle's or my grandfather's brother's wife was also Anna Eriksson. And of course, they lived next door to each other because they had split the farm. So a problem arose when the mail kept getting mixed up between the two Anna Erikssons. Now, the way the story goes, and I'm not sure that this is absolutely, objective, but not the Anna Eriksson who was my grandmother, but the other Anna Eriksson. She was a real gossip, apparently. And, of course, my grandmother's mail often ended up in their mailbox, and so she would gladly read my grandmother's mail and then talk around town about what was in my grandmother's mail. Well, this got to be such a sharp contention between the two brothers and the two sisters-in-law that my grandfather couldn't think of any other way to solve this problem than to change his last name. So, in 1928, he wrote to the government of Sweden and asked if he could change his name, and they said sure, and they sent him a list of possible last names. And so he started going down the list until he got to the B's, and he saw this name Bidell that he'd never seen before, and he said, that sounds like a good name. I'll pick that one. And so we became the Bidell family, and my grandmother became Anna Bidell, and lo and behold, the mail did not get mixed up anymore. Sometimes you have to take measures that seem pretty drastic in order to be able to have peace in your extended family. And today, I want to just talk a little bit about how to get along with extended family that might be a little more challenging. So I want to start with something that Jesus said. Now, I want to start in Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus' followers that was very, very close to him. So this is firsthand eyewitness recording of what Jesus said. In Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 4, and there we read, "Haven't you read the scriptures?" Jesus replied, "They record that in the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. So, Jesus here is responding to a trick question about divorce and remarriage, actually. And he actually responds in a way that kind of answers the question, but they sort of press him further on that. But that's a whole nother topic. So we're not going to go down that road right today. But in the process of answering this question, Jesus says something that is radically countercultural for their day. And that's what I want to pick up on today. He says that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So in the Jewish culture at that time, young men, when they got engaged, would actually build on to their parents' house. They build on a room, and then once they got married, their new bride would move into their in-laws' house, into this new addition to the house. And that's just the way things worked. Now, some of you will recognize some of the wording from, Jesus said, I am going to prepare a place in my Father's house for you. That comes out of that Jewish thinking, that he was going to his Father's house to prepare a place to build on, if you will, to his Father's house so that he can come back and get his bride and we would be together with him forever. So that's the cultural context that Jesus was saying that in. And so they would have understood that right away. Okay, so he's saying that he's engaged to his bride now, and so he's going to build on, and then once the house is ready, then they'll get married and we'll live there. Well, let's just pause here for a second. Can you imagine living with your in-laws? Not just for the first couple of months of marriage, for the rest of your married life until they pass on. That was the way it worked. Can you imagine how enmeshed if you didn't get along with your mother-in-law? Oh my! This would really be a challenging thing. I mean, we think marriage is challenging in our day and age. Can you imagine living with your mother-in-law? Now, I have a wonderful mother-in-law, and if she's watching, I love you. But the truth is, I don't think I'd want to live with her and my father-in-law in the same house, as wonderful as they are. Now here, Jesus says that a man will leave his father and mother. This is why it was gender specific. See, women, brides, were already leaving their mother and father. They were leaving their father and mother and moving in with their husband into your in-laws' house. So Jesus says, okay, good. You ladies are doing fine leaving your mother and father, but I need you grooms, you men, to also leave your mother and father. Do you see how countercultural this is, what Jesus is saying here? He's saying, look, I know this is deeply entrenched in your culture, but this is not healthy. This is not the way God intended it. God wants men to leave their father and mother and cleave to their wives as well. He wants you to form a new unit, a new family unit that's specifically focused on each other and not tied in with the original family units of your parents in any way. So Jesus was really rocking the boat here. They would have been, well, what are you talking about? I mean, we've done this for generations. A man should leave his father and mother? And Jesus is saying, yes, this is what healthy families look like. He's saying we cannot have healthy marriages if we have split loyalties. Split loyalties between your spouse and your parents. He's saying, and I know this is sort of, maybe has a derogatory sense in this, but I don't think I'm not intending it that way, and I'm certainly thinking that Jesus didn't intend it this way, but Jesus said that you can't serve two masters. And so he's saying you cannot have your loyalty split between your parents and your bride. You need to be completely loyal to one person. That's your spouse, over and above everybody else. Your spouse comes first, period. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, we do this fairly well in our culture today. There's not a whole lot of people that are living with their in-laws. And if they do, it's usually a temporary kind of situation. Now, if you're in that category where you're living with your in-laws, God bless you. We pray for mercy for you, patience, and all the good things that we can, pray in your direction. But the truth is, most of us recognize that that's probably not a healthy, long-term kind of situation. So we don't live together with our in-laws. But emotionally, in our culture, we have a more challenging time to leave the way of thinking that we got from our parents and our families of origin. We tend to kind of get stuck or entrenched in our family ways. And it's not a bad thing to embrace the good things about our family of origin. Those things we should embrace, we should celebrate, we should have those as part of our identity and so on. The challenge is identifying the things that are not healthy in the way that you grew up. And I think this is what Jesus is talking about here. It's not just physically leaving your parents. It's actually emotionally separating yourself from the things that were unhealthy in the way that you grew up. And that's easier said than done. See, because we grew up in it, we feel familiar with it, and it feels safe to us. And we sometimes can't even see what it is that is unhealthy. They say you don't know what you don't know. And so we can't identify even what are the things in the way I grew up that weren't healthy, because it's so deeply ingrained in us. Now, sometimes our spouse can help us identify those things, because maybe they came from a family that was very different, and so the two of you coming together can help each other see more clearly some of those unhealthy patterns in each other's way of thinking. And I believe that's one of the reasons God is pro-marriage, because it helps us actually grow. And in a marriage that works the way God intended it to work, I believe both parties actually help each other see unhealthy ways of thinking and grow out of those together. I think both people become better people as a result of it. But it takes a lot of courage to let go of the things that feel familiar to us. Marriage is not for the faint of heart. It takes huge courage to step into things that are new and unfamiliar, even if they are better than the way that you are familiar with. Now, marriage isn't the only thing that can do this for us. I think good friendships are the same way. And that's one of the reasons why we have church and why we have small groups in our church, to help each other grow through the different ways of thinking that we expose each other to. And this is also why we need Jesus. Why we need Jesus in marriage. See, Jesus has this amazing ability to help us be courageous. The truth is that you need to feel very, very secure, very deeply loved, in order to have the courage to step out of your familiar comfort zone and start to move towards greater health. And that is exactly what Jesus does for us. The most popular or most well-known verse in the Bible is, God so loved the world that he gave his son. He gave us Jesus so that we could experience divine love. And when we embrace Jesus into our lives, it literally opens the door for us to experience the benefits of being deeply loved. And one of the benefits of that is that we become more courageous. We are able to step out of the things that feel like our security blankets, and we can move towards newer, healthier ways of thinking. So what are the things that we should distance ourselves from in our extended families? So I'm going to talk about a few things here, and if I touch on some things that are sensitive for you, I'm not going to apologize for that, because I recognize that that very well could happen. But what I would like to recommend to you is that you reach out for help. Now, we're going to have a prayer team available at the end of the service right over here. If we touch on some things this morning that are hurtful for you, I really would like you to go and talk to them and have them pray with you. And if you need to talk further with somebody, I'm available this week. Pastor Johan is available this week. We would love to work with you. And maybe you even will need to have professional help. And if so, please pursue this. Don't just sort of push it down and try to ignore it as if everything's fine. So, the thing that we need to avoid, among other things, maybe the most important thing in our extended families, is abuse and manipulation. And let me just define that a little more closely. I want to talk about 4 kinds of abuse here this morning. The first one is physical abuse. Now, physical abuse is fairly simple to identify. Physical abuse is whenever somebody uses physical force to manipulate somebody else. And you may, if you grew up with physical force being used against you to try to push you to do things that you were not willing to do. Now, I'm not talking about just, normal discipline here. I'm talking about abusive physical contact. And if you're not sure exactly where that line goes, then I would encourage you to talk to somebody who has some expertise to help you discern if what you experienced was physical abuse or not. But if there is physical abuse in your extended family, you may need to have some physical boundaries there to keep those physical things from not happening to you. Now, sometimes it was as a child, and people don't physically abuse each other as adults in families. Sometimes they do, but if you experienced it as a child, I still encourage you to be careful, because abusers teach abuse. And so even if the adults aren't abusing each other, if they have taught their kids to be abusers, the kids can abuse each other in extended families. And we hear stories of that all the time. Cousins who are beating each other up or doing physical things to each other that are completely inappropriate. So you may have to have some physical boundaries there to avoid those kinds of things from happening. I remember hearing a story, this just blew my mind, of a young woman who, as a child, was locked in a closet by her mother. And sometimes her mother would let her out for meals and things like that. One time her mother actually beat her so badly that she became deaf in one ear. That's the kind of abuse I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be that severe, but it's another time her mother actually threatened to kill her with a knife. So what did she do in order to honor her mother in that situation? Because the Bible calls us to honor our mother and father. Well, I actually thought she handled it beautifully. Now, some of you might disagree with this, but she actually got a restraining order against her mother so that she could have supervised visits with her, because she wanted to have a connection with her mother, but the only safe way to do that was under supervised conditions. So the most loving thing she could do was to get a restraining order and then do supervised visits. So physical abuse is the first one, then emotional abuse. Now, emotional abuse is actually more challenging to identify than physical abuse. Here's a definition of emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior in which the perpetrator insults, humiliates, and generally instills fear in another individual in order to control them. The individual's reality may become distorted as they internalize the abuse as their own failings. This kind of abuse happens very often in some families. And unfortunately, many parents do this to their kids, not even realizing the damage they're doing to their children. They're simply doing it as a way to control their kids because that's the way they were controlled as children. And it's extremely damaging. And if you suspect that you are emotionally abused in your family of origin, I encourage you to seek professional help. Go and see a counselor, because there will likely be deep, deep wounds in your soul that you will need help with in order to get them to the surface, first of all, but then also to be able to heal those. And often this cycle continues from generation to generation. And so you owe it to your children and your grandchildren to face this head on in your life so that you can break that cycle of emotional abuse. So even if you feel like, you know what, I'm fine, I've dealt with it, I can cope, do it for the sake of your children and grandchildren. And if you were emotionally abused, you will likely need to have some emotional boundaries with your extended family. And those boundaries may change as you heal, but you will need to protect yourself from further damage. And here's the thing. In families where emotional abuse is common, and it is handed down from generation to generation, it will almost invariably show up in your kids' cousins, unless the parents, have had professional help healing those wounds. So you may need to protect your kids from their cousins in order for your kids not to be exposed to emotional abuse in your extended family. And I know it sounds terrible to be trying to keep your kids safe from their cousins. I mean, we want to feel like that, if any place, would be a safe place for our kids. And it might feel safe because it's familiar, but it's not safe at all. And so you, as a parent, need to take responsibility for sometimes shielding your kids from the emotional abuse of their cousins when their parents, your siblings, have not dealt yet with the emotional abuse that they experienced along with you in your family of origin. Does that make sense? Do you see how this can be really, really tricky? Because the very place where we feel that we should be safe is actually a dangerous place. Okay, the next kind of abuse I want to talk about is sexual abuse. Lots of people are sexually abused in our culture today. And the sad reality is that many, many of those people are abused by extended family, by uncles or aunts or cousins or people within our safe zone, people we trust. But also, and this is less talked about, a lot of sexual abuse happens with people that we're dating. The people we date pressure us into sexual activities that we are not comfortable with, and that is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is any time somebody coerces you into a sexual activity that you are not comfortable with. Doing anything of a sexual nature like that is sexual abuse. And this kind of abuse, too, runs in families. We learn to think in those terms from our parents. And here again, if you grew up with sexual abuse, you need to make sure that your siblings have also faced that with professional help, or else you could be exposing your kids to sexual abuse from their cousins. And that is a way more common story than what we really want to admit in our culture. You would not believe the number of people I have had sitting in my office, broken from sexual abuse from their cousins. Now, the last type of abuse that I want to talk about may be the most difficult to identify, but it actually may be the most damaging of all, and that's spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is using fear of not pleasing God, to manipulate another person. The word, the Bible says, sounds so righteous. But if you're using that phrase to try to get somebody else to do something that you want them to do, you are actually spiritually abusing that person. The Bible was never intended to be used as a baseball bat, to beat somebody into being a certain way. And unfortunately, this also runs in families. There are parents who believe this is the right way to teach their kids to do the right thing. They scare them that God is going to get you if you don't do the right thing. I've had people say to me, I told my kids that you, the pastor, was going to get them if they didn't obey. Folks, that is actually spiritual abuse. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that people blame God for that He won't have anything to do with. The most cruel and damaging form of abuse of any kind is actually when you mix religion and anger. When you mix those two together, it is a potent, toxic brew that damages the depths of your soul. Because if you can't trust God to love you, who can you trust? You see how this can be so damaging? And this was the type of abuse that we see Jesus absolutely outraged at. The Jewish leaders of Jesus' time were spiritually abusing people. They were controlling the Jewish people by instilling fear in them that God was going to strike them if they didn't follow every last ordinance that both God had given them as well as the extra ones that the Jewish leaders had prescribed under God's auspices. And Jesus came so far as to say, you are a bunch of snakes. That's what he called those spiritual abusers. If you have been exposed to spiritual abuse, you need to know that is not the heart of God. That is not the heart of Jesus. Jesus absolutely abhors that kind of abuse. And I encourage you, get help if that is your situation. So what do we do practically if this is one of these things is part of our reality? Well, when you marry or become an adult, you are responsible for your own life and for the life of your kids. And you are responsible to associate with dysfunctional family members only to the extent that you can do that without it dragging you down and continuing to damage you. You honor your extended family by not stooping to the level that they are at. Now, our culture loves to talk about it's all about family, and we have this ideal thing, that family is the wonderful thing that keeps our society together. And it is a wonderful thing when it's healthy and balanced. But the truth is, when it's not, it's also one of the most damaging places for our fragile human souls. And we, as adults, are responsible to protect ourselves and our kids. So make sure that your family respects the way you are raising your kids. If you're choosing to do this in a healthy way, make sure they respect that healthy way. And here is where I believe you need to give them very clear instructions. Tell them how to treat your kids. If you didn't like the way they treated you, you don't like the way they treat other people's kids, you tell them very clearly, this is the way to treat our kids. Tell them what to say and not to say to your kids. What topics they can talk about with your kids and what topics are off limits. What activities that you will tolerate them doing with your kids and not doing with your kids. Now, you may need to have some difficult conversations with family members. And I hate those kind of conversations. But here's a little piece of advice. Start those conversations softly. Don't start aggressively, because that typically doesn't lead to a good place. Start softly, but firmly. Think about the first 90 seconds of how you're going to start that conversation, because that will often determine the direction it takes. So if you can start that conversation softly but firmly, and then if that doesn't resonate, if you don't get where you need to go, then you can get more aggressive and more firm. And if it's not helping, you may need to set more and more aggressive boundaries with your family in order to protect yourself and your kids. Now, on the flip side, you may also need to have difficult conversations with your kids. Now, this is going to feel really strange because we are taught, and it's true, that we're not to speak ill of other people. But you may need to help your kids identify some of the unhealthy patterns in your extended family so that they become wise to how to navigate those patterns that are part of your family. Now, obviously, you do it in an age-appropriate way, and you help them see what they need to see in order to be healthy or to remain healthy in those situations. So, and then the other thing that you want to do is build your own family identity around healthy family patterns, not around unhealthy ones that you inherit from extended family. So you may need to identify clearly what those unhealthy patterns are that you are not going to follow in order for your kids to recognize this is who we are as a family, as opposed to the extended family. What do they say at Home Depot? You can do this. We can help. It sounds intimidating, but trust me, this is the pathway to health. And if you need help, we are here to help you. The truth is, the next step in all of our journeys towards health always starts with being honest. Being honest with where we are really at, and then moving forward. Let me check my messages here. Okay, I've got a couple. I have a question about your sermon. If you have a parent living with you and you are doing your best to be loyal to your spouse, how do you respond to the parent reminding you of the commandment to honor thy father and thy mother when you try to enforce boundaries? Great question. Sometimes our elderly parents will move in with us as part of their aging process. So, my answer to that is that the Bible is very clear, Jesus is very clear, that our spouse always comes first. If your parent doesn't like it, I'm sorry. It doesn't mean that you're angry and difficult with your parent, but your spouse is your primary loyalty. So that's just the way God ordained it. That's why we leave our parents and cling to our spouse. So if your parent is not happy about that, I'm sorry. They're just going to have to wear their big boy or big girl panties and get over it. Okay, next question. What happens when you have received counseling for all your childhood trauma and your parents say you had a good childhood and they did nothing wrong? How do you get past that? My trauma was traumatic. To them, it was a regular day. I tell myself this so that I don't hold on to it forever, but I'm still broken. Great question. So that is very typical, actually. We don't want to believe that we are broken. None of us do. And we all did the best we knew how with our kids. But when we as kids begin to see some of the things that our parents did that were unhealthy, it's not likely that they are actually going to see it, at least not right away. And that is when we as children have to kind of blaze our own trail, if you will. And that, I think this is exactly what Jesus is talking about when he says, therefore, a man shall leave his mother and father. There's a sense in which you're leaving that unhealthy way that your parents raised you in so that you can blaze a trail for your kids to follow in a healthier way. And it is not easy. And when your parents are in denial about it, it makes it just that much harder. but it's still the right thing to do. You got to remember this, I'm doing this for the sake of my kids. That's what I keep reminding myself and my people about. Do this for the sake of your kids, because your kids will thank you. And even if it causes tension with your parents, your kids are worth it, and they are your primary responsibility. You are not responsible for raising your parents. You are responsible for raising your kids. Does that make sense? So let me just finish here with a story about Jesus. And I've been meditating on this story this week, and it's a little bit shocking to me because of our culture where we value family so highly. Jesus' family comes to him and wants to talk to Jesus. He's in the middle of a teaching session. And they're saying, your mother and your brothers are here. They want to talk to you. And Jesus says, who are my mother and my brothers? He's acting as if he doesn't even know who they are. And then he says, everybody who follows Jesus or follows after God, they are my mother and my brothers. They are my family. Can you imagine how profoundly countercultural that would have been in Jesus' day, where extended families were so deeply enmeshed in each other? Jesus' family comes and wants to talk to him, and he doesn't even acknowledge who they are. He doesn't even acknowledge them as family. He says, no, you guys, you people that are listening to me, you people that are on this road towards a healthier relationship with God, you are my family. And there's no record that Jesus went to his family and talked to them when they came that time. I have had this idea that Jesus, was this wonderful son who loved his family, and certainly he did, and certainly he took care of his mother. Even we see that on the cross. He got John to look after his mother after he was gone. But he was not willing to play along with their dysfunctional games. We read another time where his brothers tried to talk him out of this crazy idea that he was somehow the Messiah. Jesus did not listen to them. Jesus understood this thing, that he as an adult answered directly to God for his relationship and his spiritual health, not to his family. And so he walked with God even when it cost him tension with his family. Pastor Emma said this morning that we are family here. When you see things through those lenses that Jesus gave us, you realize we really are family. We may even be closer family than your extended family through the way Jesus saw things. Because we here are all on a journey towards spiritual health through the help of Jesus. I know this is just blowing some of our mindsets and all of that. That's okay. Jesus is into that. So if you've got unhealthy family in your extended family, I encourage you, go after Jesus. And even if it causes tension with your family, do not let anybody, them or Satan or friends or anybody, guilt you into thinking that somehow you should be loyal to them even when it sucks the life out of you. Jesus is the way towards health and the way towards healthier families. Now, I don't know where you're at with Jesus. Maybe Jesus is just a swear word for you. And if that's the case, I'd like to introduce you to him, because he can transform your life. In a minute, I'm going to pray, and if you want to know him, why don't you let my prayer resonate with your heart? And I encourage you, talk to the prayer team here as well. They would love to just walk you through the introduction process. And if you're not in a small group, I encourage you, that is really where family happens, in this extended church family. You know, maybe it's time for us to clean out our family skeletons out of the closet. Maybe that's what Jesus wants for us, so that we can move forward with true freedom. Not always scared that, somebody in our family is going to do something weird and wacky, but that we can just live with true love and joy. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for the way that you love us so deeply. And I welcome your love into my heart. When I have to face stuff in my family, in myself, that I don't like, I'm so glad that you are there giving me the love, the courage, the strength to move forward on that. Lord, sitting in this room today, there's hearts with pain, profound pain, because of the way they have been treated. We welcome you into healing us, every one of us today. Help us to be able to move forward even when it's hard, so that we can experience the life that you created us to live, our best life. Help us, Lord, to have the courage to empty the closet from skeletons, to bring them out into the light where you can help us heal. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.